covers every official statement in Washington, D.C. So it is more than one point of view.
When Colin Powell spoke a huge amount of editorializing in the Syrian story, it seemed to me, though, that one of the things that's so interesting is how many of the visual elements are the same. You know, when I was in Beirut and looked and visited one of the television stations there, they're getting all these digital streams over the internet and putting together the story on computers. Everybody is drawing from the same video pool, and in many cases, Arab broadcasters are putting into the video pool, and then what matters is the script, and what the script says, how the script and the images are put together to lead the viewer to a conclusion.
Now, one thing that we did not see in CNN that we saw in Syrian was the dead bodies of the reporters killed by the Americans.
Well, we have to remember that, I mean, editorializing takes place in news media, but in different ways and shapes. It can be in the crude, direct form like you see on Syrian TV, which is really not widely seen, not even in Syria, and it works under, I mean, I've visited their studios last summer, I was there, and it works under tremendous political and budgetary constraints. They have talents there, but they can do very little given the political conditions in Syria. In the American media, there are editorializing that take place. I mean, in what they do not cover, for example. CNN admitted, according to Walter Rogers, for example, that one time they showed dead bodies of Iraqi soldiers after the war, and many viewers protested. As a result, they said, let's not do that. And the editor of CNN one time said that whenever we show dead bodies from Afghanistan, we have to remind people about September 11 so that we can basically gloss over the innocent victims who were killed in America's bombing of Afghanistan. So editorializing is not something that is confined to the direct propaganda outlets of the Syrian TV. It applies everywhere around the world. And that's why the people in the Arab world today cannot be deceived or lied to. That's why Al-Hurra will not work. What people are now accustomed to, they have far more choices than Americans do. In the Arab world, they can watch Fox, CNN, Al-Hurra, as well as Al Jazeera and Abu Dhabi Al-Arabiya. Here, we have the choice between CNN and Fox News, and we see the reporters and the revolving doors between these main channels. And of course, the spending on news media in America have gone down, and that's why we have to see similar images and pictures in all the channels.
Well, CNN has a budget of $1.2 billion. Compare that to the budget of Al Jazeera, which is $35 million. However, you get to some interesting points, Assad, about the role that politics and prejudice and ratings play into what we see on the air. When you look at Syrian television and CNN, what are some of the politics and prejudices you see at play?
Well, I mean, obviously, you know that Syria is totally opposed to the occupation in Iraq. You know, if you compare a lot with their narrations, always about the occupation, about the casualties that's caused by the American occupation of Iraq, they never use the word coalition forces. They hardly use that. There is one subtlety here. They always talk about the occupation forces. The Americans use the coalition forces. And the same thing, by the way, Al-Hurra also uses the coalition forces, never saying about any kind of occupation. In the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, they're very much in support of the Palestinians, and imagery is very big. Just like what they showed you the bodies here, that's a constant thing of showing you the death toll, the destruction that is caused by the Israelis, and they're using the same tactics with the Iraqi-American conflict.
Can I just pick up on that point? Because I think one of the things that people talked about what Al-Hurra would do is it would introduce a new vocabulary to news coverage, that people wouldn't talk about martyrdom operations, they'd talk about suicide operations, because most of the Arab stations now refer to martyrdom operations. But it seems to me that you sort of get a one-time push from introducing new vocabulary. Let's not forget that President Bush really went very far in November 2001 by using the word Palestine. No American president had ever uttered the word Palestine in public. And what does it mean for the American position on the Arab-Israeli conflict?
Absolutely nothing.
Most Arabs would say it's irrelevant. It made a difference for a couple of weeks, and people say, wow, I can't believe they're really saying it. But over time, I think that the effect you get from that difference of language diminishes.
John, that's exactly my point. The Arab public is highly sophisticated. They are more aware, even if they are not educated, more aware about the nuances of foreign policy and geography than many educated Americans. That's why it may appear significant for the op-ed page of the New York Times that George W. Bush uttered the word Palestine. I mean, that word, people know it exists in the minds of Palestinians, in the reality of the Arab world, and it doesn't need Bush to utter that word to become real. But I think the nuances of language in the satellite stations are very important. For example, Al-Manar, they never refer to the Secretary of Defense as Secretary of Defense. He's always referred to as the Minister of War. The Prime Minister of Israel is called the Prime Minister of the enemy government, and so on and so forth. So there are these differences. But I should also say, Wendy's point is very important.
Al-Manar is using Israel now. They never used to use that.
Sometimes they do. But I want to say about Wendy's point, which is true, which is the extent to which media, American and Arab, are also susceptible to pressures from the public that they are addressing. For example, Al-Arabiya, when they first started, wanted to introduce new vocabulary too. But then under pressure from their own public about how they tried to cover way too objectively Palestinian casualties, they changed because they wanted to maintain the viewership. This is the kind of straitjacket that Al-Hurra operates within. They cannot in any way appeal or appease the public opinion because they have to answer to Congress, which has its own very dogmatic, pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian agenda that it cannot waver from.
But I think where things are isn't necessarily where people think they are. Al Jazeera has a reputation for being vehemently anti-Israeli, vehemently anti-American. You know, the graphic that Al Jazeera shows of Israel shows Israel labeled as Israel, and then the West Bank and Gaza, the land occupied in 1967, a different color. I mean, where things are, it's a much more complex, multi-layered situation now on the ground that I think we have to be much more sensitive to than people are.
I say the United States government can spend millions and billions more on silly TV and radio propaganda on the internet. It will not make a dent in what Arabs feel about U.S. foreign policy. I think the casualties in the Palestinian territories, the bombs in Iraq, and the chaos in that country speak far louder than any amount of money spent on propaganda in the Middle East.
Well, Assad, you call it propaganda, but let's take a look at how Al-Hurra covered this one-year anniversary of Iraq, and you can decide.
The Iraqis were hoping that the biggest dictator in history would step down without the need for war and destruction. When he didn't, most Iraqis were horrified, convinced that Saddam's regime might use weapons of mass destruction, especially if he felt that he was going to lose the war and his seat of power.
Actually, the former regime was spreading a lot of rumors, saying that the Americans were going to invade and use some particular kind of weapons. But we did not see any chemical or banned weapons.
Iraqis were being fed lies and military announcements claiming victories allowed only one source of information. Meanwhile, some Iraqis were listening very quietly to radio news reports about advancing coalition forces. Adding to the confusion, the former Iraqi Minister of Information was broadcasting lies too big to be believed. In the atmosphere of confusion and dread, civilian casualties were on the rise, people killed by errant bombs that missed their targets. According to some observers, Saddam's regime deliberately shot down U.S. missiles so they would land on civilian targets, as a way to generate support for himself.
The former regime unfortunately used very ugly and unacceptable tactics to generate sympathy and public support.
A year has passed since the volcano has erupted, and it is still spewing black smoke and lava. When the volcano cools down, normal life will finally return. Until then, Iraqis will continue to be haunted by the nightmare of war. Mahmoud Foued, Al-Hurra, Baghdad.
So, gentlemen, you are an Arab viewer. You see this on the TV. What's your reaction going to be?
It's outrageous. I mean, first of all, you wouldn't even know that this war was launched primarily by the United States Armed Forces. They may have as well called it the Macedonian War because there were 38 soldiers in Iraq in the so-called coalition. The second, look at the attempt at which they want to explain away all the civilian casualties in Iraq, thousands of them already, by reference to Saddam using his weapons against Iraqi civilians. Well, Saddam is gone gone now, and Iraqi civilians are still being killed. Al-Hurra, no matter how hard they will try, they cannot explain or blame that on Saddam anymore. You see, this is why the reaction to Al-Hurra has been uniformly negative. It's an insult to the intelligence of anybody who reads the newspaper on a daily basis.
John,
you know, on the one hand, I agree that that was heavy-handed propaganda, but if you're talking about following what the Arab networks are doing, the Arab networks uniformly misreported the war and uniformly reported that Iraqi resistance was successful and the Americans are having all sorts of problems, and then suddenly Baghdad fell. And all the Arab viewers who have been watching all the Arab news coverage said, how did that happen? I thought Iraqis were successful.
I don't agree with you.
on TV.
I disagree. I was watching Abu Dhabi television all the time and all the reports. They were giving skeptical reports. I mean, yes, everyone was forced to go into the Al-Sahaf office, the Minister of Information, and fed the same report. But the reporters during that time were giving different outcomes, and they were very skeptical about it.
If you remember, the Iraqi government and Saddam's propagandist, Al-Sahaf, was extremely furious, and he used obscenities on the air to refer to Al Jazeera because they were that unhappy with their coverage, because they were indeed, paradoxically, given what John was saying, quite skeptical about the claims of the Iraqi government.
Let me pose this question to all three of you. If you feel, as the U.S. government apparently does, that you're being slandered in the Arab media, if this is biased, if you were looking at these two pieces, John, would you agree?
It seems to me that the language was relatively thoughtful, thought-provoking, and not as deeply biased as many American critics believe Arab television to be.
And your reaction, Jamal?
They're competing for their audience. So every single network uses its platform according to its audience and its government. Less than 10% of the stations there, or less than 15% of the stations there are private.
So these are stations that do not have to make a profit. What does drive them then?
Success. I think they are driven by success because they are an advertisement, not only for the country they represent, but for the government that backs them up. I mean, there is no question that Al Jazeera has brought so much prominence and attention to a little country in the Middle East, Qatar, that nobody ever heard of before that station. So the very cash name, designer name for that country, hinges on the success of that operation. And on the long term, I think they do have financial designs that they would like to bring some profit in. In the Middle East, I should say, that if you watch only Arabic stations, you will get a far better, more accurate picture of what is taking place in Iraq than the kind of picture Americans take from watching only English language American TV stations.
Going back to that poll from the State Department, they did ask satellite viewers what were the channels that they watched most and which were the ones they trusted most. Take a look at the figures in terms of the ones watched most. Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, 12% for the U.S.-sponsored Iraq Media Network, 6% for Abu Dhabi TV. And then when they asked them who were the most trusted stations, far and away, Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera. When they did this polling, the respondents said that they like these two channels because they are always first with the breaking news, they're bold and objective.
But I think it indicates something that's very important, which is despite American effort to make the Iraqi propaganda TV that they have, the one that Iraqis would tune in, the ones that are being watched are Al Jazeera Arabiya, which is the thorn in the side of American propaganda, and that's why the Secretary of Defense is upset.
Which is consistent throughout the Arab world. So another thing, that's the other thing that tells you that Iraqis are no different than Jordanians or Lebanese. But in many internal politics that goes on between different governments, like for example, in Syria, in Jordan, you cannot now criticize the Syrian regime. But 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that was permitted. There are red lines that are drawn, but primarily, a friend of mine who works for the Egyptian press, he made a joke and said the chief editor in the Middle East is King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. So here you have it.
I concur that the biggest obstacle to press freedom in the Arab world is certainly the House of Saud, the royal family in Saudi Arabia. And I think that they have such a suffocating monopoly over the printed, the broadcast media of the region, and they are extremely fanatic about protecting the interests of the royal family nothing that is remotely critical of their interests would be allowed. And this is one of the biggest ironies. Some of them sponsor some of these newspapers and publications that ostensibly espouses a liberal line, and yet they are championing and yet they are championing one of the most fanatic and religiously obscurantist governments in the region. Al Jazeera, of course, because of the feud between the royal families in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, allows a measure of criticism of Saudi Arabia.
The other